All right, we're good for that, inshallah. So I would ask our colleagues to mute their sound and video and have Dr. Reza and Cameron leave theirs on for the introduction. I'll come in and say a few words just before you start, Cameron, after Dr. Reza's general introduction. And then from there, it's all yours for about 30 minutes or 35 minutes. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. And my colleague Andrew Campbell has joined as well, and we will share the presentation at various times, and then we'll be available for questions.
Excellent. Excellent. Sounds great. All right. So Dr. Reza, it's in your hand once you're ready to start.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be a part of the teamwork at the Department of Economics and Finance at Sultan Qaboos University in organizing this special webinar with distinguished guests from Marsden Jacob Associate Australia. We know energy is known as the engine of economic development. Over the past couple of centuries, it has been mainly fossil-based, and that have interrupted natural carbon cycles in the Earth atmosphere, causing various types of climate change and other problems for the Earth and human systems. Human systems are now determined to make a transition from fossil-based energy to more renewable energy sources, such as solars and wind, and facing severe challenges in this transition process. This global effort towards net zero emission and decarbonization occurs across developed and developing economies. Oman and GCC countries are also actively involved, as is Australia. As academic at Sultan Qaboos University, we are very interested in working and researching on contemporary topics such as energy transition and decarbonization, net zero, and climate change. This is a multidisciplinary with significant policy implication topic. We try to bridge the gap between academic research and industrial applications of important research content. This webinar in particular falls in our effort to interact with energy institutions nationally and internationally. We had our first webinar in 2023, and His Highness Dr.Adham Al-Said presented Oman's perspective to Marsden Jacob Associate. This webinar is a follow-up so that our guests from Marsden Jacob can sketch Australia's position and the challenges they face in the Australians' economy's transition and decarbonization. His Highness, let me briefly introduce. We have Andrew Campbell with 35 years of energy experience. Andrew is one of Australia's leading national electricity market and gas market and the Victorian electricity and gas market. Andrew's specialty in energy market design, performance and evaluation, quantitative modeling and analysis, investment appraisals and business cases, and transition issues. Globally, Andrew has worked in reform, education, market analysis in Ireland, Singapore, Spain, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And then we have Cameron O'Reilly, is an energy and public policy specialist with wealth of leadership experience within industry associations and government and private sector organizations. Before joining Marsden Jacob, Cameron held senior energy policy roles in New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, including Principal Energy Advisor and Executive Director. His skills and experience encompasses market, policy and strategy design, evaluation and reform across national retail and wholesale electricity, gas and renewables. So I now pass over the floor to His Highness to have his words and explain the moderation process.
Thank you, Dr. Reza. I believe it's just a minor connection issue there, but we should be fine. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone joining us today for the webinar. Thank you, Dr. Reza, for being instrumental with Bahar as well in making this possible. As mentioned by Dr. Reza, this is the second iteration of a number of engagements we've had through Sultan Qaboos University, the College of Economics and Finance, and Marsden Jacobs Associates, where we were displaying some of the comparative benchmarks, if you like, between Oman's energy market and that in Australia. And I believe today Andrew and Cameron are going to be talking to us more specifically about Australia's energy transition and looking at the electricity market specifically. And we're looking for some insights there as Oman is making some similar transitions as well in its energy market and electricity more specifically. Now, the way we're going to moderate this is our colleagues from Marsden Jacob are going to be talking for about 30 minutes or so. And then we're going to take some questions through the Q&A, as well as we have some questions of our own as well to see how much we can share in knowledge and understand some of those concepts. So without further ado, Cameron, Andrew, please take the floor and you may start. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, His Highness Dr. Adham Al-Sayed, and thank you for continuing the engagement that we started in September last year. And we found it very interesting to understand the challenges that Oman is experiencing in reforming its energy markets. And of course, I think in terms of establishing a wholesale market, you're at a fairly early stage in implementing that, which is a very important step. And we hope today that there's some benefit in sharing the experience that we've had in Australia. In doing so, I should also acknowledge as well the conversations and the help that we've received from Dr.Reza Aghdam, and also thank the College of Economics and Political Science at Sultan Qaboos University for having us along. We will do a joint presentation. I will lead off, and when it comes to the wholesale market, I will hand to my colleague, Andrew Campbell. Andrew and I have probably been involved in the national electricity market since it began in different roles. I was in the federal government at the time. A lot of the reforms were made, and then later worked for a number of years for the retailing end of the industry. Andrew was there when the national electricity market began and has advised on it for decades. And he is one of Australia's foremost experts on our wholesale electricity markets and wholesale gas markets. So I think in terms of a combination, I hope that we can deliver you value in terms of the perspectives that we will share. Just quickly about Marsden Jacob. As a firm, we are an economic consulting firm that work across a number of areas of such as water, energy, environment, natural resources, public policy, and transport. In terms of energy, one of our core capabilities is our electricity and gas market modelling capability. And our team are specialists in the national electricity market, and also in Australia we have another market in Western Australia with a different design called the wholesale electricity market, and we also advise on gas. And we have worked on market reform across Asia and Pacific, and we have decades of experience in the industry. But I think in terms of the genesis of the national electricity market, I think there's a couple of things that would make clear. And it's important, I think, going back to your address, Dr. Al-Sayed, when you talked about the broader economic challenges and reforms taking place in Oman. And that is really how our electricity market came about. It didn't just arise in isolation. Back in the 1990s, began in 1998, but really the genesis of creating it came from national competition policy agreements agreed to by the states and federal government in the 1990s, aiming to boost national productivity by introducing competitive dynamic in sectors and recognising and separating sectors that were natural monopolies from competitive parts of the market. And that was particularly relevant to the changes that occurred in electricity. because one of the drivers of establishing the national electricity market was to encourage more sharing and competition between generation and linking the electricity supplies of the states on the east coast of Australia, because the industry had been traditionally developed by government vertically integrated utilities that just operated within one state. And there was a dynamic there. We're also trying to separate and allow open access to monopoly infrastructure and separate, as I said, natural monopolies from competitive parts of the industry. And in the case of the electricity market, that was generation and retailing, the selling of electricity to the customer. And so that was an important part of the dynamic of the reforms that created the national electricity market. And it didn't all happen overnight either. It was developed in stages. There was progress in terms of reforming the utilities in the states, separating them, corporatizing them, and there effectively became a trial wholesale market in Victoria, which Andrew might talk about, which operated initially as a single buyer model. So because the industry was learning as it went along. And they were part of it, but not in every state. There was privatisation of energy assets, all of which took place in the lead up to and just after the national electricity market began. And when it began, it only linked a couple of states, but today it links 5 states. And those states, you can see on the map, Australia is a vast country, as you know. And the national electricity market is one of the longest interconnected markets in the world. And it links the north of Queensland to the bottom of Tasmania into South Australia. It does not link for reasons of population and cost, Western Australia or the Northern Territory, but you are talking about a market that now covers probably around 90% of Australia's population, and overall has around 40,000 kilometres of transmission lines and cables. And why was the important thing is the market operates to an objective and also to a standard, a reliability standard that is focused on delivering reliable energy to consumers and only operating to a point where a sort of amount of unserved energy is tolerated within any particular year, the market reliability standard, which is set at a very low amount in terms of unserved energy. And the market objective is there, you can see that, but it's particularly, it's important to efficient investment, efficient operation, and in the long-term interests of consumers with respect to price, quality, safety, and reliability and security of supply. And that is important because in the end, you make changes to electricity, you run electricity for the benefit of its users. It's not an industry in itself, it's an enabling industry and a critical part of a national economy. And in terms of establishing the market, there was a governance arrangement that had to go with establishing an interlinked national market where previously there'd just been state-based markets. And that involved establishing a market operator, a real-time market operator to operate the electricity and gas markets on the East Coast, and to run essentially a bidding and settlements process in real time. And that's called the Australian Energy Market Operator. A separate role was established for a national regulator to regulate the monopoly transmission and distribution networks to ensure they were efficient in terms of their operating expenditure and capital expenditure. And a process they had to go through to get approval for new network investments. And the regulator also monitors the competitive behaviour of the wholesale market, which is the generators and their bidding, and regulates the retail markets. There's a separate body, which is called the Australian Energy Markets Commission, which makes rules for the market and reviews those rules at the periodic, deals with rule changes and monitors the performance of the market overall. It also houses a thing called the Reliability Panel that reviews the appropriateness of the reliability standard to which the market operates. And only in 2015, there's a new national body called Energy Consumers Australia, which represents the interests of the small customers, small households, small business, to ensure that their interests are heard within the governance framework, because as I said, in the end, electricity market operates for the benefit of its users. And so in terms of the, the energy supply continuum, if you like, it is AEMO obviously operating the power plants, the generation side on the left, and to a degree, to deliver the electricity, they have to be monitoring the performance of transmission lines and interconnectors and managing settlements there across regions. The role of the regulator, the AER, is particularly to monitor the performance of the natural monopolies, the transmission and distribution networks, but also they are monitoring the behaviour of the power plants on the left. They are also monitoring the behaviour of the retailers who deliver to the final point, which are the users, the homes, the office, the factories. And so that is the essential thing is at the one end of the spectrum, you have generation, which was subject to competition. In the middle, you have natural monopolies, which are regulated, and they will always be natural monopolies, but their behaviour, their expenditure, their investments are essentially subject to approval by the regulator. And at the far end, the consumer end, there is a competitive dynamic established between competing companies seeking to compete for the business of different consumers, whether they be households, it extends to all households, or businesses. Then, of course, but there's important thing is the most significant and most complex element of the system is the wholesale electricity market or the spot market. And that is where Australia has now 25 years of experience in operating that market. And there's been a lot of changes, and as a result of changing generation, further changes coming. And there are particular design elements of the market that are important to note, particularly as you enter this stage of establishing a wholesale market in Oman. And here I might hand over to my colleague, Andrew Campbell, who is a specialist in wholesale energy markets, to go through the next few slides and some of the experiences Australia went through. Sorry, Andrew, you're still muted, Don.
All right, I think Andrew could unmute himself now.
That's better. Thank you. I'm unmuted. Thanks, Cameron. As Cameron says, the next 2 or 3 slides, I'm going to talk about the NEM spot market, really the way it is today, the considerations that were given to its design, and observations on how it has performed and how its performance is looking moving forward as the NEM decarbonises. I note and support what Cameron says in terms of the long evolution that occurred to arrive at the current design we see today. This occurred, really, it started in the state-owned utilities, where they started to think more commercially, setting up strategic business units, single buy models. The various states had their own individual markets. We had what was known as the National Grid Management Council, work with the states and the industry to establish the rules and to get the NEM finally working. Equally important to that was the owners of the assets, the governments, the state governments, who decided on the industry structure, who would be the trading entities, how many individual generated units there would be, the retailer structure, and so on. And they set up things such as vesting contracts when the market started. And all the states had very different views on these issues and set up very different arrangements. Just going down the list on slide 7, the energy-only market was selected. There was, as you'd expect, there was lots of debate at the time on whether there should be a capacity market. The key issue with the energy-only was it gave the signal at the time you needed capacity. That was probably the overriding criteria which favoured energy only. We had separate markets for ancillary services. That spot market was developed a number of years after the NEM started, when the NEM started in a much more simple manner with contracts for FCAS. On the 1st, I think it's the 1st of October 2021, the NEM moved to having the energy market settled on a 5-minute basis. Now, this added a lot of extra data to the settlement process. And I think it'd be fair to say that a number of people and parties who were in favour of 5-minute settlements may be having some second thoughts on whether the benefits of that really outweigh the large cost to date and moving forward. It was really done to support batteries in a sense. Gross market design rather than a net market. And I do note that gross market does have high costs of credentials associated with it. We have contracts which are used for hedging, which we'll talk about. And there are high costs with margin calls and all sorts of things that do favour the larger players in the cost of hedging. The market price cap. This is when we think of them, that's not the maximum price that the spot price can go to. When the market started, certainly started at a much lower number. In Victoria, it was $1,000, just to introduce the risks on a gradual basis. It used to be known, I can say it used to be called the VOL, or the value of lost load, which is assessed independently in the market at around about $40,000 a megawatt hour. And the market price cap is the price cap, which is a balance between the risks it introduces to parties and the signals for investment to maintain the reliability standard. Self-commitment, as opposed to having a central market operator commit units, was always an issue which was heatedly debated at the time. That went in sort of hand in hand with having maintenance, having no central maintenance as it was done in the past, but have that market driven. And as it's turned out, the self-commitment has worked well, and the signals that the market provides to have generators in service when needed have actually performed. We have various classes of generators. Scheduled means that AEMO, as the market and system operator, actually determine what generators will actually determine the dispatch based on bids put in by generator units, and every generator unit puts in bids for every 5 minutes and is allowed 10 bands. Semi-scheduled came in sometime after the market started, when we had a lot of wind being developed, which was known as non-scheduled because they weren't controllable. And AEMO was getting to the stage where AEMO wanted to be able to turn down wind generation when there was too much. And so they introduced semi-scheduled generators, which means that AEMO they bid in, and AEMO can request that these generators actually reduce their output. It's hard to actually ask these guys to increase output when there's no wind. So that's the genesis of semi-scheduled, and that applies to solar as well. There's been lots of there's no gate closure provisions in the NEM. Generators are allowed to change their bids right up to just before the 5-minute period that the bids apply for. This is known as rebidding, and I can actually send you some examples of some rebidding and how things change in the last few minutes leading up to the actual dispatch. The rebidding, as the slide says, there are no restrictions other than really when entities do have market power for whatever reason, and they abuse that market power. And this is within the Trade Practices Act in Australia. And look, there have been a number of abuse of market power, but by and large, the market has been competitive. And those abuses, while they have existed, are not very frequent. And certainly that, there is a reliability standard, which is pretty close to that used pre-market, which is expressed in terms of expected unserved energy, which is zero, you might know, 0.002%. So they're the fundamentals of the spot market. Just looking at the key design issues, there was always different parties have always had different views on the spot market. Whether in fact the spot market is the fundamental market and contracts are used to hedge that, or whether the contract is the fundamental market and the spot market is really a balancing market. My view is it's more the former, but history has shown that contract prices and spot prices have really followed each other quite closely, with contract prices really reflecting supply risk. Certainly the energy market and the spot market does need to be designed to provide adequate revenue for generators in the spot market. And the design was based, when it started, on generators with different levels of fuel cost, a common clearing price, which meant that the highest bid, everybody was paid. And that was essential for two reasons. One, if generators were paid as bid, and that model was suggested, then would have everyone trying to guess what the spot price would be, and you'd have a very chaotic merit order. Plus, it wouldn't be possible to have contract derivative trading based on a common spot price. So that's the price at the time. There was also, and the debate actually still goes on today, about locational pricing and whether we should have more locational prices or less. When the NEM was designed, there was serious lobbying to have one price across all regions, and there was lobbying to have prices at every major node, and they settled on what was known as regional pricing, which is basically a single price per state, which does result in price separation within states and between states. As I should say that with the move to decarbonisation and generation located in more remote locations, there certainly is a move to have more prices and nodal prices, and I think that's called, basically they call this under the CAGADI reforms. I think we've spoken on self-commitment, but that has really worked quite well. At the start of the market, there was a lot of debate on transmission being market, non-market, and a lot of work was put into this. And market transmission was really transmission which could buy it at one end at a certain price and sell it another. And typically these market facilities spanned between two NEM regions. and bought and sold at different prices. Now this happened. We had I think 3 market lines actually developed, and they were successful to an extent, but really they really never properly worked as market transmission lines. And I think 2 of those have now been converted to what's known as non-market or regulated transmission. So it was really never that successful. There was issues of technical issues in the dispatch engine, how losses should be represented, how losses should be represented in the pricing model. And as you probably know, that the model that was used was having static marginal losses in the wholesale market, and for the distribution network, average losses, static average losses. With the move to wind and solar, the current model, where we have losses varying substantially over time, each hour, has sort of started to bring into question whether that static marginal loss factor is still appropriate. And there's been a lot of work looking at what's known as dynamic marginal losses, which in a sense is quasi-nodal pricing. One of the objectives of the NEM was to allow for trading across the NEM, and this was for example, for retailers in one state to contract with a generator in another, so as to introduce competition. This required that there be interregional hedges, which could hedge against those regional price differences. And to do that would require what was known as the settlements of those transmission lines to be available to do that. Now this has, as I'd say, has partially worked. Most of the hedging between generation and transmission occurs within each region, and there's not a lot of hedging that occurs between generation and load between regions. There was a lot of talk early on when the market was started about the need for a day ahead market. So people could actually put bids and offers in for volumes for the next day. That never occurred, and there's never really been a large demand or push for that. Fundamental to competition, and this was realised at the start of the market, is information. We know the 4 tenets of competition being large number of entities competing, homogeneous product, entry and exit, and information. And a lot of effort was put into providing information to the market. And this went from 10 years out in terms of their planning documents, to 2 years out in PASA, to 2 weeks out, to the day ahead through pre-dispatch, and having pre-dispatch updated through the day, so that those signals are there for the market to see and to respond to. And this information is really, really critical to the operation of the NEM, particularly the day ahead pre-dispatch, so parties can actually see whether there's an opportunity, a shortage or not of capacity today and moving forward. Thank you. Thank you. Just on the benefits, when the early market started, such as the Victorian market, and things became a lot more commercial, one of the most obvious initial benefits was the improvement in capital utilisation, particularly generator availability. I'll give you an example. Under the utilities in Victoria, Loy Yang A, which is its newest unit, was planned to have an availability of 72%. I know because I was there. Hazelwood Power Station was operating at the time, which is now closed, at around about 55% availability. Post-market implementation, Loy Yang operated to about 95% and Hazelwood in the mid to high 80%. So that was a huge increase in availability. And most of this was associated with manpower management rather than technical issues. Certainly, the markets were a lot more competitive than they were forecast to be, and the buyers of the assets who bought generators in Victoria and New South Wales and so on experienced a level of competition that they did not expect. Some were most surprised, the buyers from the UK were most surprised that when they bought a large generator that they could not themselves influence price. And this did result to them, the market has resulted in periods of competitive and low prices. The merit order, which is how efficiently generation is dispatched, the market didn't actually result in a merit order as strictly as efficient as utilities. What was noticed early on was that large hydro units, for example, moved more generation to the off-peak than the peak. And the large coal units didn't generate as much at high price times as they would have previously, high demand times. And why was that? Because it was the price volume trade-off. If they could reduce their output by 5% and increase spot prices by 30% or even more, it was worth it. And we still see this, the way the market operates, this price volume trade-off. But that wasn't to say that the market wasn't still operating efficiently. Certainly the market did introduce innovative thinking. As I say, the generators looked at ways of actually increasing their output, of undertaking investments to increase their capacity and their availability, and a lot of innovative thinking in terms of small generator units that could actually participate in the market and add additional competition. These were things that certainly would not have occurred under the previous state utilities, where there was no incentives on the owners to do that. And we also saw, as the slide here shows, a lot of new transmission developed to capture arbitrage opportunities between regions of high prices and low prices, and add value to the market in that way. Just on the financial markets, certainly there was always a question early on about who should operate the financial markets, whether it should be the market operator or someone else. Decisions were taken that it should not be the market operator. And early on, we had lots of over-the-counter contracts, and slowly it moved to exchange-traded contracts through the Australian Stock Exchange. And we've seen a lot of innovation of products as well. And there's a lot more innovation will be needed moving forward as the concept of baseload and baseload contracts becomes less relevant as we have high sol in the middle of the day, and we're really looking at hedging the morning and evening peaks, the so-called horns. And that innovation was really came through market thinking and through the buyers of the contracts, which were the parties trying to actually manage their risk in supplying consumers. I think there's the consistency of the legislative framework across the NEM also helped to give investors confidence in investing in the NEM. Certainly when in Victoria I can speak of, when those generators were sold, they were sold on the back of 3-year contracts, which really at the time seemed very short, when it was always thought of you may need a 10 or 15-year-old or 20-term contract to sell a large power station. But they were sold on the back of 3-year vesting contracts. And the one reason that could be done was the confidence that the market design and stability provided to the buyers. And through time, certainly private ownership and investment has increased. The question about whether an energy-only market would incentivise new investment, I think it has certainly been answered. And certainly a lot of it is done through, a lot of the investment has done through the large retailer generator companies, the GenCos, who are looking to invest in their own supply chains. But there is a lot of interest by entities in solar, wind, batteries, and so on. A huge amount of interest. I think that the question about whether these electricity markets can attract private capital has certainly been answered. They do so, and probably more so than in the past. I think it's probably Cameron, I think.
Yes. Thanks, Andrew.
So
that gave it a lot of what we have learnt and the context in which the market was introduced, how it's evolved, a lot of the thinking at the time. And it's a dynamic process because the change is occurring. An electricity market is something that has to change and continue to operate uninterrupted as it does. And so when the NEM began, you can look at the generation mix was largely coal, gas, or hydro. In other words, forms of generation you could rely on their dispatch, and when they may be able to be available to generate, they would generate. But emissions were not priced into the generation price, and emissions, since the NEM has begun, have become far more of a concern of policymakers. And throughout, Australia has not agreed on a national approach to pricing carbon aside from a short period. But we've recently seen legislated in Australia as last year a 43% emissions reduction target for the country by 2030, which is premised on an 82% renewable energy share of the national electricity market. So there's a lot of challenges that are going to arise from that framework within which the market will have to operate. And because we haven't been able to achieve a national carbon price, and there was a different approach to supporting renewable generation, which favoured direct subsidies. And so a target for renewable generation was legislated in 2001 and then increased to a 20% share by 2010. And now, as I said, although it's not a formal target supported by subsidies, it's expected that renewables were expected to reach a much, much higher percentage by 2030. But a very big consideration in Australia was, at the same time this was occurring, there were also generous subsidies for rooftop solar. And this drove uptake, particularly from 2010, to a position where now 30% of households in the national electricity market are what we term prosumers. They are consumers and producers. And as a result, those consumers tend to sort of, as you can imagine, it's mainly rooftop solar. They are still drawing from the grid largely in the evening when solar's not producing, but they are often sending energy back into the grid in the middle of the day. So what we've seen in the national electricity market is a demand profile that has become peakier, because it's essentially, in many ways, in terms of dispatch, energy sent back by rooftop solar is largely treated as net demand. Essentially it reduces the demand because it's below the market threshold. And this has occurred at a time where, if you look through the history of the NEM, if you go back 20 years ago, the number of people in Australia that would have had air conditioning has grown substantially. And it is cooling, particularly in Australia, and occasionally heating load that drives from the residential sector, that drives peaks in the market. So you've had a combination of increases in maximum demand at the same time, because net demand has been dropping in the particularly times of the middle of the day. Minimum demand has been dropping. That variation on a system that had historically grown up with coal generation, baseload generation, as at the core of the system, has particularly challenged the economics of that traditional generation, even without a national carbon price. Because, as you know, coal generation is an inflexible form of generation. And to operate, it obviously needs the fuel and has a level of operating costs that is assured. So it has a minimum dispatch price that is often now below the actual market price. And so it is those factors, along with the emissions challenge, that is really driving the change in the NEM's generation mix. And what we do know is, under the emissions constraint, and as a result of direct government policies on a regional basis to support generation transition, which is largely favouring variable renewable energy, wind and solar supported by storage, there will be a guaranteed change, a transition in the generation mix, because coal is aging and exiting, and the new generation is coming in progressively, largely supported by government underwriting and the reality of lower emissions and lower dispatch costs. So therefore, we're having increasing amounts of what we termed semi-scheduled and unscheduled generation. And then if you look to tell the story, on your left-hand side, this is renewable generation, I should make clear, in the national electricity market. Obviously, overall, there was a large amount, and still is a large amount, of coal and gas. But when the market, if you go back to 2007, what we term renewable generation was largely hydro. 2019, you see very significant growth in wind, rooftop solar, and utility solar on top of that hydro. So the market penetration of variable renewable energy has increased in the last 12 years. And at the same time, it will have to keep increasing, and is guaranteed to keep increasing by a range of government policies to support renewables. And coming to what we term the impact of rooftop solar, this is a profile from AEMO of particular years and some of the shape of the demand profile and the time of day. And what you're seeing there is that increasing what we term the duck curve, absent variable renewable energy, particularly solar, demand in the evening and the morning, early morning, is fairly solid, and then it it plunges away in the middle of the day. And as a result, in many jurisdictions, sometimes the market price drops to sometimes negative levels at those times, and then rebounds in the evening when the variable renewable energy, largely solar, comes off. And so if you think about that, if you're, for instance, a coal generator with needing to dispatch and operate continually, if you're operating through the day, you may only be making money here and losing significant amounts of money here. And the degree to which these spikes occur in terms of demand is often driven, as I said, by weather conditions, particularly with the growth of heating and cooling devices within households. So with all of those changes, what is happening in response to those trends? Well, the National Electricity Market now has a 2-yearly plan called the Integrated System Plan to project what the NEM will look like out to 2050. It's updated, as I said, every 2 years. And it forecasts that in the future, wind and solar, utility and rooftop, combined with short duration and long duration storage, which is essentially battery or pumped hydro, and firming generation will progressively dominate supply. Firming probably mean largely gas-fired generation. And as all of that traditional generation, particularly coal, exits, and is projected to exit towards 2040 in full, the NEM will need other things, markets that it didn't require before, because services such as inertia and system strength had been provided for free, if you like, by synchronous generation like coal. And what the other factor is, of course, is that the amounts of new wind and solar required to replace the exiting coal requires unprecedented investment in inter and intrastate transmission, because increasingly the best places for wind and solar will be remote from the demand in the cities, whereas before our coal generators were located fairly close to the main sources of demand in the cities. And as generation will not be aligned, as we know, wind and solar cannot be always predicted when it will generate. There is a profile for solar, but conditions can vary. There can be cloud cover and so on. Huge amounts of storage to capture generation when it is generating, and then using it when demand requires it will be needed. So there's huge projections for investment in batteries and pumped hydro and the NEM. And there is consideration as a result, is in this environment, is there sufficient revenue and opportunity for the forms of firming generation that you may need for the periods when wind and solar is not available? And that is leading to discussions about whether we are going to need to change the market design to support capacity, which has uncertain economics, by giving them at least some capacity payments to ensure that they are viable to come into the market. So that is what the Integrated System Plan says that our mix will look like by 2050. So it's distributed photovoltaic, utility scale solar, wind, distributed storage, which will mean household batteries and EVs, which will be coordinated in some cases, utility storage, which would be, could be of various scales, and peaking generation, a small percentage of the market, but critical to those periods of high demand and low variable renewable energy outlook generation. And what is also going to be reality is, to make this vision possible, we're going to need an exponential build in new transmission. And already that is envisaged within the national electricity market by increased interconnection between some of the jurisdictions. But the big thing is building transmission to areas of high wind and solar. So concentrating transmission development in what's called renewable energy zones, and also significant transmission to points of significant storage, which includes expansions of our existing Snowy Mountain scheme. Snowy 2, a very 2,000 megawatt pumped hydro storage, requires new transmission. So how is it going? Well, the thing that I would emphasize is that this is a transition that still has a long way to run. And it is a transition that is really in our 3 largest states by population and load. because Tasmania has always had a lots of hydro generation, and South Australia, a smaller state, already has the vast majority of its generation coming from renewable energy. Whereas to look to deliver the electricity from coal in the last 12 months to March, to March or today, in New South Wales, we were still getting 73% from coal, Queensland 77%, and Victoria 66%. For the NEM overall, because they are the largest states, 64%. So we are still got a long way to go to cover that exiting capacity, let alone to cover any new demand that might come from electrification of transport or hydrogen. So what we know is that to deliver the new generation mix is going to require a lot of new transmission. Transmission needs to be coordinated, which is why governments are focusing on, we can't build transmission lines to every new generation, or every new wind and solar plant proposed. So we're going to focus on particular areas. And what we're seeing though, is that every time a coal generator exits, because also a coal generator is high capacity, is high generation capability, it tends to create price volatility as you lose that capacity, and some challenges with increased reliability and stability risks. And as I said, once you start to lose that thermal coal generation, which is synchronous, you require new system services to be provided by the market. And what is also happening, which is the NEM was a national market, still is a national interconnected market, but state governments are increasingly concerned about the ability of their market to deliver that new generation. And so they're procuring a lot of that, even if they're not building it themselves, by using the state's balance sheet effectively to support that new generation. One of the things that we're also facing is when you have vast amounts of renewable generation and new transmission, your footprint of the energy industry grows substantially into areas it once wasn't. And that means transmission lines and wind and solar on farmland. And that means landholders wanting to be paid, or at least having to accept that coming onto their land. And that is not a quick process, and is not always a smooth process. Then for us, what we're also seeing is that the transition is calling upon a lot of challenges, facing a lot of challenges, even particularly during COVID, but even now, from the fact that much of the rest of the world is doing the same thing, whether it's batteries, whether it's new transformers for transmission and so on. And we need a huge workforce to build this new infrastructure. So we are facing global competition for that transition, which is pushing up costs. And the thing is, while all of this is occurring, we can see the transition into electric vehicles and the potential growth of hydrogen. We'll see demand growing from where it is now. So not only are we having to replace this generation here, the 73% New South Wales, 77% Queensland, 66% Victoria, build that new transmission, build that new renewable energy, build that new storage, we may have to build it for a level of demand that's higher than it is today. So in short, the transition is going to be very difficult, because at the moment, what we're seeing is the old capacity is potentially exiting faster than the new capacity can enter. So I wouldn't want to leave you with the thought that this will not be a difficult process. But in the meantime, it is all happening and has to see the NEM evolve to deal with these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron and Andrew, for that very, very insightful Australian experiences with developing the NEM and some perhaps lessons learned. Now, let me start with a few questions of my own to both of yourself and Andrew. And by all means, just tell me who's better versed in whichever. So some of the thematic issues that are coming through right from the start, and having seen some of those issues in the slides, is the institutional setup. And from the governance perspective, if I may reflect in a very shallow way, because I'm not proficient in all of those institutions in our energy markets, but what we have in Oman, for example, is a single buyer model today, with a trial-based version spot market operated by the same single buyer. So that in itself raises some questions on what would be the best model moving from the single buyer also being the market operator to start with. Should that role be split for governance purposes, or would the single buyer be versed enough to be able to manage this process, at least in the medium term, and then find sort of a divergent path? And you've mentioned, for example, that stock exchanges could play a role into this. Could that be something that we can think about here as we're developing, alternatives for hedging and whatnot? I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, both Cameron and Andrew.
I might let Andrew go first on that one. Watch your mute again, Andrew.
Yeah.
No, this is a really good question. Look, I years ago, when I was, this is pre-reform, I was sort of, this shows my age, I guess, a party who was working for what was known as system control, basically, and writing contracts for we were a single buyer from generators to supply demand. Now, it wasn't quite the market that you're referring to, but it does involve a lot of difficulties that have probably been encountered. So I would the issue. So the single buyer has to make estimates of what demand will be, and I'm not sure on how the auction process is undertaken in Oman to actually select or clear basically which suppliers or generators will be providing that power.
So that is on a merit basis, basically, the cheapest, basically most efficient at the time, which also presents some challenges as well, but it is a merit-based system. Dr. Reza could confirm this as well, because he's been working with the regulators as well. So let me just also clarify that for the case of Oman, the spot market is really for the big buyers, not for your retail consumers as well. And in many ways, it is, to our understanding, it is designed to fill that extra demand and create, unexpected changes in demand by industry, basically, not your household consumers or retail consumers, if you like.
So it's really a balancing market or a market that really supports a more competitive side of the market rather than the mass market. If I'm hearing this. Correct.
Yeah, more or less. I don't think the competition argument in itself, as it is in the Australian example that you've provided, is primarily, the competition is required, no doubt. But I believe it is really to look at the capacity needs of these producers who are looking for energy and large quantities of it, really, and to allow those producers and generators who do not come in and provide at the merit base to be able to divert some of that directly as well. But I think it also addresses some of the issues in the development stage we're at in Oman, where there are mega projects coming through and they require significant portions of energy. And having the market to source that energy with some flexibility probably would be advantageous from some vantage points, I believe. But I don't claim to understand the dynamics there yet, but it's good to be well informed of other experiences that, we avoid some of those pitfalls, if you like.
Yeah, one of the lessons from reform is that these things are best not rushed. And in the Australian scene, I think one of the reasons that for the successes they've had were that they were not rushed. I know in the Victorian case, it took twice as long as originally planned in the Victorian market, and the NEM was many years in development. But just back to the single buyer model, there's two issues here. There's one is basically the generation capacity, if you like, that you will contract for a period, and then how is that capacity actually used? So the single buyer model addresses, I'm assuming, both of those, that you'll contract for so many power stations or megawatts, and then the system control will then determine which one to actually use.
Absolutely.
I know, I'm not certainly in the reform process that left very little incentives or initiatives for the actual power stations themselves. The experience we had was when that model was put to them, they objected violently because they couldn't go out and basically develop their business really at all. It was subject to the single buyer. So it who basically filtered the needs of consumers to the generators. But I would add that, in Australia went through that process. I think it's a necessary process to go through, but there's a fair bit of thinking to do in moving forward from that.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
that leads me to another question. You've spoken about the price movements in them between 15,000 and the 1,000 based on the different dynamics of the different states. Would a completely, I'll use the word very liberally here, liberated energy market where spot prices determine the demand and supply lead to higher sort of price spikes? Something similarly we've seen, for example, in the gas prices in Europe, obviously after the Ukraine conflict. Would, in this case, as a secondary sort of effect on the energy market and electricity market, would spot markets bring that volatility through, or are there ways to protect from large spikes while protecting all the stakeholders' interests as well in the market?
If I can address that, certainly the impacts on the input costs to the generators, which supply power, are directly translated through into the spot market. I've actually got some, and I could send you some pictures to show you the pricing dynamics of that, and how those costs have been reflected through. And they're normally thought about in terms of energy and capacity. So energy being the supply of the actual supply of electricity, and capacity being the amount of megawatts that one needs for short periods of time. And we see that when there's capacity shortages, we get very high price spikes. And when there's high energy costs, we can get continual prices in the hundreds of dollars, or even the high hundreds of dollars, but not so much the thousands of dollars. So in the market, so high costs such as the high gas costs that we saw through Ukraine did result in almost a doubling of spot prices in the Australian market. But more the prices up to about $300 to $400, not prices above that, which reflected capacity issues.
Right.
So that's what we.
Right. So Cameron, if you allow me to come to you with this question, you've talked about the investments required for grid expansions for two reasons, obviously. One is the renewable element, which is of major concern. I'd like to kind of pick your thoughts on how might countries like Oman, for example, where it's weighing or leaning heavily on renewables in the next stage of electricity provision and green hydrogen as well, because that's the big story here.
Sure.
And we have the same issues as you've mentioned, the remote rural sort of power generation that needs to be connected with customers. Does it make sense to plug it into the existing grid, or do we need parallel grids to manage the process of intermittency and availability of day and night? And so what kind of thoughts can you share with us on that?
Well, it's the issue for us, and I'm sure for you, is often the grid is just not built where the best generation sites are. And so one goes with the other. You can't have the new generation you require without the new network. And then, of course, the way that solar often dispatches requires that you may need for the system stability to put in some additional services, some additional backup. In Australia, it's been increasingly generators may have had to put in synchronous condensers or storage to support their investments in the renewables, and also to ensure that the market system frequency and stability is ensured as the network is built out. So it's not a simple case of simply just building a line to the new generation. That nature of that generation presents challenges to the development of the network itself. And coming to New South Wales, I guess there was some thinking. There are 3 major renewable energy zones that were identified in New South Wales when I was in government. And the thinking behind them was, we did look at where there was market interest, obviously, in developing new capacity. But there was also, was there a mix of wind and solar in those areas? Because I understand sometimes that can be challenging. But then without any sort of surety, but generally wind can be more throughout the day and in the evening, and solar obviously has a pretty clear dispatch profile. And also we thought about, well, how far were they from major transmission lines? And so one particular zone in New South Wales is close to the interconnector to Queensland, which is 500 kV. One in the centre of the state was close to the 500 kV ring around Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong. And another was located on a proposed new 330 kV line to South Australia. So, there's a market, and there's also the reality is you can't get this generation without new grid. And so I think there does come to a point where you do have to plan your grid to a degree centrally. And that's kind of what's begun to happen with the integrated system plan and AEMO, really identifying where there should be transmission enhancements, because it can't be piecemeal.
Right. And that also, you've mentioned prosumers as the consumers using their rooftop PVs, and they are pushing back into the system as well, into the grid. Now, essentially, all right, after discounting any sunk cost into the process, that's free energy, electricity being pumped back into the grid. How is that priced into the NEM sort of system and the pricing? Or is that, that capacity that's pushed back is going to grow? And as your graphs have shown, some interesting growth is happening there. How's it handled in this whole system? Not that we have it enough in Oman at any point, but that is an option that's on the table as well.
Well, it's having a couple of effects. It's not always allowed to go back into the system. If the distribution grid finds that it's going to create instability, it will curtail that generation. And that sometimes some believe that occasions that's the most economic option. There are other things going on. Some retailers and some aggregators seek to capture that generation and store it for dispatch at a more convenient time when demand is up. And increasingly it does provide, for those who can afford it, the case for investing in their own storage. And partly that may come in time with their own electric vehicle rather than necessarily home storage if you start to have vehicle to grid technology. So even for distributed solar, it's increasingly requiring new solutions, more storage, particularly being part of the equation. But, you know, when it has been, it has what's called an effect on, I think it's called net operational demand. It means that draw from the grid drops and the market price drops. So it has had an effect, as I said, on the economics of existing generation. And to a point, it is rooftop solar can cannibalize the revenue of utility solar. So they're not actually necessarily, yeah, they're not.
Just to add to that, Cameron. So the actual consumers themselves get paid a feed-in tariff, which start off quite high and now is lower, but it might be in the order of $30 to $40 per megawatt hour. And the retailer who is basically paying that feed-in tariff obtains the value of the spot price, which might be very low.
Right. But I would imagine, Andrew, that's an offset on the electricity bill itself, right? It isn't a direct payment as such.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there are different arrangements that people can enter into, but that's precisely correct.
Right. And I want to ask you, gentlemen, with regard to storage, because that plays an important role with the renewables. And you've mentioned pumping hydro. Now, you've mentioned that South Australia has those, you know, that, or Tasmania does, but in drier climates like ours, what kind of solutions are we looking at that we can build from and start to kind of even diversify the storage offering besides lithium batteries or any other technologies, or even as in the Nordic countries, sand seemed to have come up as an interesting viable option as well, I think, or in North America, was it? We've got a lot of sand. I'm not sure how we can use that, but what kind of options in storage might we see that will help us with these intermittencies, especially with solar?
Interesting. If I could just take that, Cameron.
Yep.
What's happening is, look, in the Australian market, yes, storage is clearly important as we move to solar and wind. And people normally, the way that the companies think about things is that solar goes with batteries. It's diurnal. The battery doesn't have long storage, and battery and solar can provide a continuous period over a day. Wind goes with gas-powered stations, because wind lulls can last for days or even a week or 2 weeks, and a battery would be exhausted. So the normal thinking in the large utilities is wind and open cycle solar and batteries. There have been a number of parties in the Australian market who are I use the word trying to develop pumped hydro. And for whatever reason, these are even in Australia, are very difficult projects to get up. And the net result is we're not going to have a lot of pumped hydro. It may mainly be batteries or other storage devices. So while we do have some mountains and all that sort of stuff, pumped hydro is not going to be a large part of the solution in Australia.
And we can have hydrology challenges ourselves at various times. That existing hydro is largely not pumped hydro, which is what they're talking about. But there are no standard economics for pumped hydro. It's an engineering project, and every single one is a different project. Whereas at least with a battery, I guess, you know, maybe roughly what the cost will be for a certain size battery. You find a grid location, so you can align it with renewable generation. I think I agree with Andrew. I wouldn't expect that we may get the level of pumped hydro that's envisaged by some of our governments when the reality sets in at the costs. And we're already seeing that with one of our very high profile pumped hydro projects.
Yeah. I'll add that increasingly, when we look at the way that the future is looking in Australia, there's now a stronger bias to wind than solar because solar all in the NEM anyway. Since we're north to south, it all occurs at the same time. And the need for gas generation to manage the lulls, because storage will be inefficient. Now, in the ISP, the long-term planning document, and all the studies that we do and others do, by 2050, we still need dispatchable gas generation to address the renewable lulls, particularly in winter, more and more in winter, where solar is less, there's no solar in the evening peaks, and you have long periods of no wind. Now, that may be generation using green hydrogen. And we're increasingly moving to that, but even AMO currently is still silent on what is the fuel being used to power the generation and required when we have long periods of no wind and solar, and the storage is exhausted.
Right, and that kind of plugs into the question just put out there by Davis on the seasonal storage. If that, I'm not familiar with this, but longer duration storage options. And here it states, and what kind of mechanical storage technologies that could be considered besides what you've already mentioned on the potential or lack of pumped hydro. Is there anything such that we can talk about today? Could hydrogen be that kind of storage, if you like, as complex as a process? Dr. Reza, you want
to? I wanted to also ask that Tasmania had come up with some proposal of becoming NEM's battery. If you can also elaborate on that. That was actually like Tasmania has lots of hydropower, could actually pump when the extra production can be generated to fill up the storage to. So another questions to Andrew. You mentioned about over generating. This is real, like with solar and wind. So we have over generating. That if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned about this.
Did I? Over generation
of solar and wind. I took a note.
Dr. Reza, I'm not quite. I'll answer the first question first, and then we'll come to the second one.
Yes.
Yeah. So certainly Tasmania had, is as you know, it's an island state to the south of Victoria, which is basically powered by all hydro generation. They've got a lot of natural hydro there. It's not a big, not a large state. They have a lot of industrial load, so they can vary their hydro generation to be less or more than their load. They are connected to Victoria through a transmission line known as Basslink.
Yes.
And so by varying their hydro between more and less their demand, and the hydro pretty much matches their demand, you can get flows going back and forth on the link. So in that sense, it's seen as a battery to the mainland, to Victoria and the mainland stage, because it can actually import by reducing their hydro and increasing their hydro above their demand, export. And they do this without the normal cycle losses. So it becomes quite economic. And that's how Basslink, the current interconnector, tends to work. They arbitrage the Victorian price by buying low prices and selling at high prices. Now, they want to actually increase their interconnection to the mainland by about, I think it's 1,500 megawatts. I think that's about right. So they're currently 500 or 600. They want to go up to at about 1,500 to 2,000 more megawatts onto that. Now, to do that, to get this same buy and sell with this increased transmission, they need to put in pumped hydro. They can't vary their generation with respect to the load to the extent which will provide the swings on this new transmission known as Marinus Link. And they've spent a lot of money, and I know in the hydro they've got 2 or 3 floors of their offices dedicated to Marinus Link. I think, from what I can see, that the development of pumped hydro to do that is proving to be more difficult than they first imagined. They've got some schemes in the hundreds of megawatts only, and our thinking is they're thinking more of being an exporter through very large wind generation and just selling that via Marinus Link. So that was the theory. They can do it currently. To scale it up with new transmission that connects, they need to build pumped hydro themselves. And that
so
is being proven.
it appears that every problems ends up being more investment in network and grids to make it more reliable, feasible.
Absolutely, and that's
I think
absolutely.
same goes in Oman. Most of the renewable capacities which they have installed and they are planning to install is in a part of Oman which is not connected to the network. So it is increasing the demand of connectivity of the southern part of Oman, Dhofar, to the northern part, which is the most populous density is located. So it's very interesting.
It's not cheap.
It is not.
All right. On that note, Andrew and Cameron, we've taken a lot from your time. I understand it's getting late over there in Australia as well. We thank you very much for those insights and I think lessons to be learned, especially for our part of the world as well, as we're moving into thinking about how our electricity markets should function with those mandates of climate change and emissions and competition and efficiencies with ever rising demand for energy in this part of the world, especially with the growth rates that we've been experiencing in the last few decades. I think there's great thought that needs to go into this as well, and much to be learned. I'd like to thank Dr. Reza for organizing this as well.
No need.
Been instrumental, so I should always.
Pleasure.
And Cameron and Andrew, thank you very much for making this happen. I hope we'll have more engagements down the road and maybe have you visit Oman as well to experience our beautiful weather and country. I've been in Australia a long time ago and I've got fond memories of Western Australia, more specifically. And if we're talking renewables, I think wind and solar works very nicely in that part of the world.
Yes.
All right. So again, thank you very much. And thank you for those who have joined us as well through this very exciting discourse. Thank you very much. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.
And
thanks very much.
Thank you.
On our behalf, can we thank you? And I realize important occasion next week. So in advance, can I say Ramadan Kareem to you?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All blessed times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So